All right, let's go ahead and call the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Could I have the roll call, please?
Megan? Brian? Brooks?
Here.
Rob? Alyssa? Michael? Barb?
Here. All right. For the agenda, if whoever's making the motion, if you would be willing to move 8 to 7 and 7 to 8. Just that.
No.
Go ahead.
No, I'll make a motion to approve with that change of item 8, moving up to item 7, vice versa.
Tote second.
Okay, we got a motion and a second to approve the agenda with the switching 7 and 8 around. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Consent calendar. We have to vote on those. Yeah. Okay. So
Brink, I'll make a motion to approve.
Bassett, I'll second.
okay, we've got a motion and a second on the consent calendar. All in favor? Opposed? All right. Minutes. My trusty proofreader over there.
Move to approve.
Okay.
Tote second.
Okay, I've got a motion and a second to approve the minutes of the December 5th meeting. All in favor? Opposed? Okay. Anyone here for public comments at this point? Glenn, got anything to comment on? Okay. All right, we're going to move on then to the North 9th Avenue Plan Development Draft Ordinance on page 78.
So this looks probably very similar to the one we saw last time. The highlighting's kind of removed. It lays out the dimensions, the minimum lot area, the lot width. The setbacks are kind of standard for the district. What the difference is, so we discussed, and in order for it all has to be contiguous in the PD to be part of the same PD. That's why you now have block 9, lot 17 in there rather than 17A, B, C, D. So 17 would be in there to provide the other ones to be contiguous. So the one additional consideration to potentially mention on this is Ron and I talked, I think Monday, about how there are, at least on the interior 2 units, there is no door to the backyard. Are you still comfortable with those being in a plan development? So our solution as a city would be, we would require the plat to have a mutual access easement for those property owners in the middle to tend to their backyards. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention as well, and Ron's here, he can talk to you about it. But their preferred approach when we talked to him was just to do the PD, and they'll subdivide and sell and move forward from there. Sure.
You want to just give us your name and address, Ron?
Ron Weber, 27521 481st Avenue, Canton. In regards to our conversation with Patrick, that 17 is not going to be involved in that because that one is that the water is not, that's 1 meter. So that one will, I know you guys have to do what you have to do to make this work, but the 17 will not. So it would just be the N2 units.
Yep. Do 4, 16, and 20, do they have the same?
Same setup. Yeah, there is no door each to the backyard. There is not.
So we would require those to have an access easement around so they could tend their backyard.
Yep. That what we had talked about, correct? Yes.
Correct. Assuming planning and zoning is still comfortable with a PD.
Did you say that they do have to be contiguous? So
Correct. That's
So-
why 17 is in there, even though not much is changing about it.
So we're saying 17 is in the PD, but you're not planning on selling
We
it
can't.
separately, yes.
Nope, we cannot
can't
do
sell
that
it, yeah.
because it's metered with one water meter.
But it's still in the PD, so, but that's fine. You just, and then, as far as the access, do we need to, because if someone puts in a fence, do we need to allow both sides to have a fence or a gate to get access, or how do we, because if someone's gonna put a fence in the backyard, how do we require each side or just like like, for example, we'll start at the top, lot 16D, would that be giving the access to 16C? And then 16A would give the access to 16B? Would, do we want to be that specific? Because somebody's going to put a fence in there, and it's going to be an issue, I think, if we don't address it sooner than later. So I guess I would say the outside unit closest to the inside unit would be the one giving the access. I don't know if we want to be that specific ahead of time, or.
Yes, if I can answer that question, I deal with a lot of developments in Sioux Falls. They make a fence on each side. So they make it so if, let's say they would ever form an HOA, so when they come in and Ron Weber's Mowing Company comes in to mow, they can open up the gates and go all the way through. And they make you put one on each side if you're one of the middle units. On the end units, you just have one, but then the middle units, that's a requirement that you have to have. So if there would ever be an HOA to get in there. Also, one thing that I would like to add to that is like even for fire, and I don't know where the pole meters are there, but if they need to get access in there, it's easier to go through gates, you know what I mean, instead of trying to go through a fence or over it. So, but yeah, I would personally, I would make that a requirement to make this work. I think it, if we know that going in ahead of time, and let's say I'm trying to sell these down the road and say, okay, if you are gonna put a fence, I see you have an animal and you want Fluffy to be kept in, you're gonna have to, if you're an inside unit, you have to have a fence on each. And usually the minimum requirement in Sioux Falls is a minimum of 6 foot, because they got such big mowers. They want a minimum of 6 foot fence. Or I should say gate. We could knock that down to 5 if we wanted, but more than likely I know Rod here in town does a lot of the mowing in town, and I think he's got some pretty healthy equipment. So,
Ron, are you suggesting that access be located at the far rear end of the property in alignment with the utility easement?
yes,
Since they can't put any structures or anything there anyway.
no, right.
So if we make a motion to approve this, is this up for approval or is this still in discussion?
So this is a discussion. We would have to schedule it for public hearing.
Okay.
I'm not really seeing any other issues.
I guess I would recommend just changing that 10-foot utility and drainage easement to also be an access easement.
Okay. And then, do you want that approved, drawn up on this, from Midwest again?
Yes.
So so everything would be spelled out, just clear for everybody. Okay? Yep, we can do that.
And then in the PD, would we specify that the 17s will have to stay together? How specific do we get on this stuff? They can't be sold separately. Because, we're not all gonna be on this board forever.
Yep. So
Hopefully.
if they tried to subdivide 17, it would not comply with the PD or R2. So they would still not be able to subdivide.
Okay, so that's gonna be documented in something somewhere.
Yes, it's in the PD.
Okay,
Yeah, it's in there on page 80, the lot 17, block 9 is that one whole building, and the others have block 9, 20A, B, C, D, like that, so it's kind of,
okay.
But they would have the option to come back and update the PD if, say, it burned down and they were gonna reconstruct it.
Right.
They would have the option to come back.
Come back and put in 4 lines and, yep.
So what do we need to do then?
Just kind of a stamp of approval that it looks good for public hearing. There are a couple of places where it still says Augusta Place that I'll go back and fix, so that'll be the only change, otherwise it'll look like this. So we'll correct those 2 or 3 little areas where it says Augusta, or several areas where it says Augusta Place, because that was the last one, use a template. So we'll fix that, then we will get it scheduled for public hearing based on the way the calendar lays out. we're probably looking at January 16th for P and Z, and then it would go to the city council on the 21st because the 20th is a holiday.
Sorry, these things never go fast.
No, that's fine. We knew that going in.
Okay, appreciate your patience.
Could I have one more question? Do you want me to correlate that with Midwest tomorrow? Or are you gonna be touching base with them, or how do you want me to handle that? What steps do I need to do at the next?
Nope, that would probably be, you would need to create the plat.
Okay, that's what I'll do. Any other questions for me? You bet, thank you.
Okay, now we're gonna go back to cell towers. We just swapped it around, so come on up.
So what you have in front of you is a whole lot of information, a lot of pages. I'm trying to find the most recent text here. We have to dig through all the consent calendar. There's some minutes. All right. So the highlighted yellow is my commentary in there. The red are comments from elevated towers, and the green is highlighted sections that are from various ordinances, how they do from Gretna and Watertown and Sioux Falls and other places, how they kind of do their distance separation measurement. So just wanted to give you some examples. They have some commentary in there, and we'll hopefully talk about it and come closer than we did last time. Their preference obviously would be to get things moving forward, but we'll work through it. So I tried to include all the examples we previously put in there, I think 2 packets ago. Those are back in there, and they had some additional commentary that starts on page 20. And some examples around Sioux Falls where you can see the proximity of towers to, this looks like probably an office building on this one. So there are examples around Sioux Falls where they are quite close to, and that start at buildings, and it starts on page 20. So I will turn it over for discussion.
Yeah, could you just give us your name and address again?
Yes, I'm Jonas Snyder. I'm 5313 South Eastwind Avenue, Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Thanks.
If it's okay, maybe should I share a little some of our thoughts. Just to kind of, because we've had a few meetings, I figured it made sense to kind of reorient the group on the important topics, at least from our perspective. I think some of the prevalent things is that Brandon is currently fairly significantly trailing behind other similar sized communities around here in South Dakota from a wireless bandwidth standpoint, primarily because there's only a single tower on the north side of town and then a water tower a little east of that. When you look at communities like T and Harrisburg, they now have 3, 4, and 5 sites. Verizon's been attempting to get a tower on the south side of town for 3 years, unsuccessfully. And that's largely due to the fact that as the zoning code is currently written, it's prohibitive enough that there's just no parcels that would meet the requirements to build a tower on the south side of Brandon, because they have to be on industrial lots and they have to have 300-foot setbacks. So hopefully you guys agree that it makes sense to proactively put in some language in the zoning code to accommodate towers for future expansion and growth and to provide better connectivity for the community. And I guess it's our position is that this is for the public good. We feel like the spot on the south side of town is far enough away from any habitable structures that it doesn't pose a significant health and safety risk. And I think that there's some good, like Patrick mentioned, if you look at page 20 and beyond, I found with not a lot of searching, approximately 10 sites in Sioux Falls or the greater Sioux Falls area of monopole towers. So those are the big steel poles you can see in those pictures that are in some cases as close as 15 feet, but almost all within 100 feet of other habitable structures. So in urban areas like Sioux Falls, I think what you'd find is probably more than 50% of all the towers in city limits just wouldn't meet like a 300-foot setback from any structures. That being said, the Sioux Falls Code is written in such a way that they want you to be 1.1 times or have a 1.1 times setback of the total height of a tower, meaning like if you have a 100-foot tower, it needs to be 110 feet away from a building. And I think that's a reasonable expectation. But in like Sioux Falls' case, they leave the door open for variances so that in situations where that's not feasible within a certain area, you know, it has to then come before the Planning and Zoning Commission. So I might recommend that you set one where you're not just, it's not the Wild West if you can build a tower anywhere in Brandon with no consideration for setbacks. I think some of the recommendations from Patrick on setback heights are fair, but for the, you know, future growth and things, it might make sense to at least leave the door open to, if there's an area of town where a certain setback can't be met, that it could at least be submitted for review before the Planning and Zoning Commission. So happy to take any questions or field, I guess, any comments from the group.
So I want to make a couple of comments here before we get into the specifics. So I know there's a lot of examples that are shown here. It's not always a good idea to create an ordinance based on examples. And the reason why is a lot of times things get built, things get constructed prior to ordinances, whether it's Brandon's or Sioux Falls or Box Elder or Watertown or Gretna. Things get built prior to ordinances going into effect. And so I caution us to just say, oh, well, here's an example of one right next to a residential. We don't know the history behind it. So I didn't read all 93 pages of our material here tonight, but as I glance through this, it looks to me like everybody is at least the tower height away. And in my opinion, I think that is valid. So with that, I'll even go so far as to say I think it should be from the property line. I know there's been some discussions about habitable structures, but as we talked in previous meetings, what happens on one property should not impact what you can do on the adjacent property. Just because a tower goes in first doesn't mean that the neighboring property is now limited of where they can build or what they can do with that property. So in my opinion, the setback distance should be from the property line and not from an adjacent habitable structure. I guess as long as I got my mic on, I'll also, I think it's, in my opinion anyway, it's okay to, rather than within a habitable structure, what people do on their own property is really up to them. So, for example, if a church or a school or somebody wants to lease to a tower and they want to put it next to their building, that's up to them and their insurance company. I think our position here is to protect the public and protect neighbors, not what people are necessarily doing on their own property. So when we talk about putting it next to a habitable structure, if the school district wants to put one on their property close to their building, I guess that's up to them and their insurance company, whether they want to do that. So, but I think what we need to do is protect adjacent property owners and the public.
I kind of agree with most of that. I guess I would still ask that there be a setback for schools, just for, you know, when we're talking about safety of the public. If it's a commercial building, it's adults, they decide to go there, that's one thing. But when we're talking about a public building where it's kids, they don't have a choice. So I would say on that case where it's a school or a public building, I guess if it's a city office, that might be different. But school, I would say we still need to have setbacks for safety. One thing to get you a little bit more room, maybe we could discuss, and I'm not saying that this is the right way, wrong way, whatever, but as far as future building, like the site you're talking about on the south side of town there, if we went up to the setbacks instead of the property line or the habitable structure, if we went to the setback, that wouldn't affect future building, because along Sioux Boulevard there, those houses, a big part of their value is what their future use might be, and where the current habitable structure is certainly isn't where future structures may be. So If we gave them up to the setback, they wouldn't be able to build anything there anyway. That might be an option to get them something that we could use, I guess. So I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to looking at setbacks versus property line or current habitable structures, but I wouldn't go past the setbacks. I don't think we need to do that.
I was gonna bring up that same thing. I had read that in the Sioux Falls, and I think something else I looked up, I saw the similar thing where it was basically to the nearest existing habitable or residential structure or the building setback line, so I agree with that too, that could be an option.
One other concern I have with our institutional zone, when we were first looking at rezoning and we had some local parks that we rezoned, there was a lot of topic of towers, and there was a gentleman that had concerns with us having such a broad institutional zone and not having something, a subcategory in there for neighborhood parks. Because neighborhood parks are kind of treated differently than like Aspen Park or McCarty Park, where there's a lot more stuff going on. And so I guess my concern would be is if we do put it in institutional, if it worked out and there was enough room to put a tower in there, that would certainly cause some concern. And I don't like the idea that we recently rezoned a lot of neighborhood parks that we didn't allow towers, and then all of a sudden we got them rezoned, and now we would allow towers. So I do have some concern, and would like to see if there's a way we could address neighborhood parks, so they don't end up with a tower after we rezoned and didn't have towers permitted. So I would like to see if there's something we can do on that too. With the south property, there's a lot of things that the site that you're discussing on Park and Sioux. Really, the biggest setback issue you're going to have, I guess. So if we look to the east, there you have a property, but I think you'd probably have enough room for a tower if you went up to the setback. How far are you? You're like 300 feet from the property line to the apartments to the northeast or northwest, and you're almost 400 feet to the school, but you're only 140 feet from the property line. Do we need to have a way that there is the property allows them, a variance or an access or whatever, so that if the adjacent property is okay with the tower being within so many feet of their property line, but it's not within so many feet of their structure, that would be permitted? Is there a way to do that?
I think Patrick kind of had a note or a recommendation around that, which would be, and you might have to explain it, Patrick, but essentially, if you're within a certain proximity to another parcel, you would need their written consent to build a tower. I don't know which parcels we'd be close enough to on this site, because like you mentioned, we're 300 or so feet from the residential to the east, we're 300 feet or so to the apartments on the northwest. So what we're closest to that is currently zoned as residential is the school to the south. So maybe by Patrick's recommendation, we would need written consent from the school, as I understand it.
So the two immediately adjacent properties, the school would be across the park, but you would have the drainage ditch owned by the city, and you have a parcel to the east owned by Minnehaha County Water Corp. So those two entities would potentially have to sign off then with the proximity thing, because I don't imagine there's probably 100 feet from a tower here to here, and maybe you could get there on this side, but maybe not. Let's find out.
It's generally, not that this is the most important consideration, it's generally not favorable for a tower owner to have that, because sometimes you can kind of be extorted for, well, you're gonna have to pay us a certain amount for that. So it's not ideal, but I guess that's maybe a cost of doing business. Although in this case, I don't know that Minnehaha County or the city of Brandon would try to make us pay for it.
And I think we're kind of talking about if you could meet certain requirements and setbacks, you wouldn't need that. But if you were not able to meet those, so it would be limited, I think is kind of what we're talking about, right? Limited in certain circumstances, you'd have to ask for that. So
Have you approached the city about the possibility of locating this tower in either Aspen Park or McCarty Park?
Not up to this point, we haven't, no. And part of that is currently those city parcels, we would still have to rezone or rewrite the code because you can't put towers in institutional. But
But setbacks, I'm thinking, would be easier than the location that you're talking about.
potentially, yeah.
Well, some of those things that you guys mentioned, we always try to write these not necessarily for this specific situation, but for the greater good coming down the road. So with that, you guys are above me with the setbacks and property lines and stuff. Would that still work if they were looking at a different spot? Because I'm guessing we're going to need this tower, and then we're gonna need another one at some point.
You're almost certainly going to need a tower on the east side of town in the not so distant future. Especially came up in an earlier meeting that the city's maybe not super excited about renewing a lease for the water tower. So to replace that, there's definitely going to need to be something. And I think you're going to encounter the same challenges on the east side because it's so heavily residential as well. So yeah, I think that's an important consideration.
remind me, for the example that you're discussing, you're talking about a monopole design. Is that by far the most common, or are there still a lot of different types of towers constructed? Or
Sure. There's really three different types of towers. There's called a guide tower, which are the ones that have big steel cables that go off to anchor points that hold up a smaller tower. You only see those in rural areas where there's wide open space and it's not, there's no space constrictions. There's self-supporting towers, which are lattice structures that have sort of cross members that go up. But in town, almost you would never see someone in modern times build anything other than a monopole tower, just because they by far take up the least space.
I don't know that it was in our packet, but I was reading and I saw an example that has an example where it says, in any district or any use located within 300 feet of a residential zoning district or use shall be a monopole design. I saw that was spelled out, so maybe that'd be a non-factor, but I still might like to see that.
That wouldn't be an unusual requirement. Yeah.
So if we go forward with something like this, more than likely, we will have residents in to discuss it. So we just need to be prepared for that and have our reasoning as to why it's appropriate or not appropriate, right?
I don't know if you, what causes, is it usage, people on, I mean, for more towers, I would say, is it because there's more people on it at one given time? Is that what?
Yep. There's really two reasons you'd build a new tower. One is to fill white spaces because you're just far enough away as the crow flies from another tower. That's more like if you're driving down I-90, you're going to see a tower every like 5 miles. But in a community like Brandon, it's what they call densification. So there's only so much bandwidth that one tower with the antennas on it can put out at any given time. So you need increasing numbers of towers as there's more and more people in that footprint so that everybody can have reliable connectivity. So because Brandon's in a relatively flat area, it's not as, I think you guys all know, it's not as though there's no cell service here. You probably get cell service pretty much anywhere. It's really just during peak hours, and as you get further away from the tower, you get less signal than those who are closer to it.
So to kind of summarize kind of my impression from the group, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of the standard you're looking at for separation distance is the height of the tower from the property line and principal school buildings, not if they have a maintenance shed, but the actual school building itself. And if they can't meet that separation distance, then you would be open to, if they sign a waiver, they accept the risk and you're good. And you would like them to be a monopole design. That's kind of what I've heard, but if I'm wrong, let me know.
You know, if somebody signs a waiver and moves away and the new person moves in, the waiver doesn't count for the new person. I'm not sure.
Should have to be something in the deed.
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
not
so-
sure I'm, you know, I'm not sure I'm on board with that waiver thing. But I think for the measurement, to the property line or to the, if it helps, maybe to the setback on the adjoining property would be maybe okay. Or maybe find a different location where it's not such a problem.
So maybe to, if we can maybe come to an agreement. So some of these are like 1.1 times the height. What if we just said the height of the tower to the property line? And then you still have the setback, whether it's 15 feet or 10 feet or 5 feet or whatever. So that still gives you a little bit of a buffer. So if it's a 100-foot tower, 1.1 would be an additional 10 feet, which is about the setback on an adjacent property.
Yeah, since these crumble and don't fall like that, you know, requiring just the height of the tower probably would be okay and not have to worry about an extra amount.
Again, my concerns about saying we can't do it on school properties is if they want to put a tower on top of a school. I mean, we're talking, all of this is about freestanding towers, but you also have to know there's more than just freestanding towers that sit on the ground. There's towers that sit on top of structures. For example, the school district could put one on top of the Performing Arts Center.
100-foot tall?
Doesn't have
Is
to be
that-
100 foot tall if it's
No, a
already on
shorter
top
one?
of a 60-foot building,
Oh,
is my point.
I see.
You go up on, I was up on top of the VA hospital.
Yeah,
I'll bet they have 30 antennas up there.
well, that's a point.
And each
also.
of those
That's a point
antennas
too,
is
yeah.
probably only 8 or
'Cause
10,
it just has to be
8 to 10
100
feet
foot
tall,
off the
but because
ground.
of its location
Right.
within the city, the elevation of that location, the elevation of the tower, you don't have to go as high, but, you know, that's a perfect example of, you know, like the Performing Arts Center could have one on top of their building, and it doesn't have to be a 100-foot tall tower.
Just because of my ignorance, maybe I don't think I understand setbacks and lot lines and stuff maybe quite as well as this group. But when you're talking about 1.1 times the height of the tower, are you talking from like the internal setbacks, like to that, you know, to the line, or are you talking like crossing the street over towards the school? I'm just trying to wrap my mind around 100 feet from what, if that's or 110 or whatever, if that's a fair question. So from the base of the tower going to, so the internal sort of property line. Okay, so the site we're talking about wouldn't qualify, just so I'm clear.
Unless you got a waiver from the adjacent properties to there's the city property to the west and the, whatever that, the Minnehaha, water to the east and then the school to the south.
I understand. Okay.
So you have those properties, but your structures, you know, the school is gonna be 400 feet from the tower, you know, and so, you know, if the school gave you a waiver, I guess that might be an option there, but I don't know how you wanna do that.
So if you do it from the setback, it's less restrictive? Or from the property line? Which way is less restrictive for the tower people?
From the setback would be, I mean, it'd give the tower another, depending on the setback, another 20 feet or whatever, depending on the setback. So it'd give the tower a little bit further if you went to the setback, but with these adjacent properties, you still wouldn't meet the setback. So you'd still have an issue, you're gonna be past the setback, but the city property to the west isn't, I mean, that's just a drainage area, so you're not gonna affect anything there. And the Minnehaha County water, or community water, I don't think they're gonna have an issue, their utility. And then, so the biggest issue would probably be the school, but you're 400 feet from the building. I don't know that they would have an issue either. I can't speak on their behalf, but, and then to the east is your closest residential, but if you went either the height of the tower, because I don't know where you're looking at on that parcel there, you're probably looking at the northwest corner, is that kind of where you're looking at doing the?
That's right. Yep.
So if you went to the northwest corner, you're 250 feet-ish to the property line. And how tall of a tower are you talking?
100 foot.
So you'd be plenty far there, and you're 300 feet from the apartments northwest of there, so you're plenty far there as far as towers falling over. So the biggest issue is on that site is those adjacent properties and the school. But
I just want to mention, like, you go to these residential areas, there's Bluffs as an example. There's transmission lines out there that are fairly tall. And I know they were there prior to the houses being there, but they're built right to their, I mean, they're built within less than 100 feet of those towers, and they're 100 feet high. Those tall, I'm just saying.
I have
Yeah, the power
just a
lines.
different view on something existing that you build up to, but
What I'm saying is we're worried about having sign-offs on stuff, where it would, if something was existing, would we want neighbors to sign off on it? If that's what I'm saying. Like the tower that is existing already, like in the industrial park.
those transmission lines, though, there's a easement for transmission lines, right? You can't build within so far of a.
I understand that, but go up there and look at those houses. They're right there.
But yeah, the towers fall like dominoes. So there's.
Well, I
there's
know
still,
I'm just saying we're talking towers. let's talk those towers then that are existing. And I just have a hard time putting so much regulation on this when we have towers that are existing going right next to residential. That we're okay with giving building permits for it next to that where they could tip still. There's nothing saying they tip like this. I mean, anything could tip anyway, really. I mean, even this could.
Right, but they are designed to tip like dominoes. So, and I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that there are setbacks on transmission lines, right? I'm pretty sure. So we're just talking about setbacks here too. That's all we're. I understand what you're saying. But there are.
I don't know how I want it. We're making a rule for something and we have it already to a point with these highline wire poles going through places. And they're gonna, I mean, the further west we go, we're gonna run into it more because it's all NSP over there. So I mean, it's gonna happen. We're gonna keep allowing it to happen. I'm just putting it out there so we're aware of that out there because I know everyone doesn't live by that. I've built a few houses by it. No one seems to care. Those types of towers. And I'd be more worried about living behind one of those than a cell phone tower myself. But that's just me with high power voltage going through it.
So it's hard to tell from GIS where exactly the base of one of the transmission lines is, but here's an example in the bluffs where, assuming that's somewhat accurate, it's 70-ish feet from the closest wall of the house. And if you wanted to go to the property line, the closest one's probably 30.
Yeah, obviously for future reference, our recommendation, where we don't necessarily have as much of a vested interest in future tower development, but I'd advocate for looking at it from habitable structures. I think that's really, in my opinion, the primary concern is, can a structure fall down and damage another adjacent property? So that makes sense to me, but I respect the commission's view on it. I also realized I misspoke. I said that the tower that we have requested to build is 120 feet. I said 100. My apology.
A similar application, instead of a telecommunications tower, I'm looking at our WEX ordinance. And that, it says setbacks, WEX shall be set back a distance equal to no less than 1 1/10 times the total height of the structure. The setback distance will be measured from the base of the WEX to the nearest property line. In no event shall the height of a wind energy conservation system exceed 55 feet. And residential NRCs or neighborhood business district, or 150 feet in a CBGB LIHI in the industrial district as measured from the ground to the rotor hub. I mean, a WEX tower is really about the same as what we're talking about here.
What's a wax tower?
Wind energy conservation system.
Oh, okay, thanks.
They're typically either monopoled or guy wired or and this talks about as an accessory. This chapter 15, 15, 14 is accessory wind energy conservation systems, which basically says you can put a WEX up, you know, in residential area, you can put a WEX up in commercial areas as well, as long as it's only supplying for that facility. But to me, this is really a very similar situation. And I know we went many meetings on figuring out what to do with the wax when someone wanted to put one in.
So is the issue whether we do habitable structure, setback, or property line? Is that where we're struggling with? Trying to decide which one?
We also need to figure out what zone we would allow it on, what type of zoning. That lot they're talking about, that's NRC, right? Currently,
I believe so.
and we don't really want it on NRC because that's where we put properties in when we bring them, when we annex them, and we don't want. We want a little bit more plan before things go in there. If we put it in institutional, that's our parks too. Do we want it in all of our parks allowed? I'm not saying there's gonna be a tower in every park. I'm saying do we want it allowed in our parks? Do we want it? We don't want it necessarily in only industrial because there's areas that you would want a tower, but you don't want it to be zoned in industrial, and then that plan goes away, and then you have this industrial lot where you don't want industrial. So that's whether we need to have some kind of a utility zoning or something. I don't know, but that's my hold up right now is what zone? How do we have a zone that works for this?
I don't have a problem putting it in commercial. I mean, if Sunshine or somebody wanted to put one up behind their building, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I just don't want one put up in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
But to facilitate this particular issue, we couldn't do commercial, could we? Because that would be spot zoning.
Whatever we do, I don't want to create a zone, an ordinance based on this specific application. I want us to do what's right for the long term for the entire city. Not well. Okay, what do we have to create to put it here? Unfortunately, that has continued to be residential, without anybody wanting to put in commercial. At some point, we're gonna have to run into some type of commercial, some type of institutional, some type of something else. And it's probably gonna be met with some resistance, no different than that southeast development across from the golf course got met with some resistance. But at some point, we can't just continue to add on in that direction with houses. At some point, there's gonna be something besides houses. So if a wireless company wants to propose buying a piece of property next to the school and zone it commercial, zone it institutional, I don't think that would be spot zoning. I mean, if that's the street, that's gonna be a major street at some point because of the crossing across the river. And so that's probably not a good place for residential anyway. It's probably a good place for neighborhood business or commercial. 40 years down the road, that's gonna be a high traffic street.
Can you put it in institutional, and I hear Michael's concern about the parks with conditional use or some way to limit that? You're concerned about, it would just be, open it up for the parks, and we wouldn't have any way to stop it, right? That's
Yeah,
your concern?
That's my concern. I'm not saying that all of our parks are going to get a tower. I'm just saying that if I bought a house that backed up to a park and all of a sudden someone's putting a tower there and the city just had it rezoned into institutional and they didn't allow towers, I'd be at some meetings. So if there's a way that we could look at that, just institutional is such a broad thing right now. It works for a lot of things, but it works for a lot of things. You know, I mean, it's just, and if we throw towers in there, then all of a sudden that's, you know, we're rezoning churches now into institutional, which I think works good. But now, you know, churches are a lot of times in residential areas. Do we just all of a sudden now we have towers that can go in church parking lots now, or you know, church properties? That wasn't, I don't think that was necessarily something that a lot of people that are okay with the church being an institutional are okay with the tower being an institutional. So I think there's some concerns there with how broad institutional is.
I think no matter whether we allow this in institutional, whether we allow it in general business, whether we allow it in whatever district, at some point you're gonna be up next to residential. So the only way to protect that is to put a distance between towers and residential properties. Because at some point you'll have two zoning districts against each other, whether it's residential against institutional, whether it's residential against an HI, whether it's residential against LI, whether it's residential against something. At some point, you're going to have that possibility where a tower could go in next to residential. So if that's what we want to protect, then why don't we just put in the ordinance? I think we might have something in there for billboards, I'm not sure, but within X number of feet of a residential district to protect that.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the thing we're trying to avoid the most is a tower falling down on somebody's house, then the setbacks are probably the way to do it. If we were allowed these in institutional, I think small neighborhood parks would not be able to provide the correct setbacks, so we wouldn't have to worry about them going in there. The big parks like Aspen or McCarty would have enough room. But if somebody with a small neighborhood park comes in and says, oh, now you can have a tower in the park next door to me, no, we can't because the setbacks will prevent it. Personally, I am not as worried about living or having a tower in my sight line from my house. Doesn't bother me as much as it does other people. And I think, like you said, commercial or institutional, but the setbacks are the thing that will either let something be there or not be there.
Yeah, I guess we keep talking about the fall on the setbacks. The fall is not the thing that concerns me. I mean, a tree could fall, all these things can fall. Personally, it's not the fall that concerns me. So if it was in my neighborhood, it wouldn't be the fall that would concern me. It'd be the electromagnetic waves and things like that. I don't want to live near power lines if I don't have to, and I want to live near a cell tower if I don't have to. It's a very different thing. I know lots of people that live back up to railroads, back up to busy roads, back up to all these things. Some people have problems with certain things, some people don't. It's a different thing when you buy a house with something there versus you buy a house and then something gets put there. Because that might be the thing that you don't want. Some people want to live near a lake, some people don't. Some people want to live near a mountain, some people don't. But so, I don't have, I'm not as concerned about the fall thing. I think the fall thing is going to be taken care of with setbacks. I would say when we're backing up to residential, things like that, if we could add in a little buffer, I think that would ease a lot of concerns. I don't think we need to go so far that they can't build a tower anywhere, but I do think that along residential, there should be some extra consideration, especially existing residential. Because it's a very different thing when you build up to something versus something gets put in your backyard. That's just a different thing. So
What's the distance? What's the number?
What do we have for a buffer between residential and what would be the next, GB or commercial, or what are those buffers like?
If we just say a tower can't be X number of feet from residential district, then do we care if it's in industrial, or do we care if it's in general business, or do we care if it's in light industrial or heavy industrial? If that's what we're trying to protect, is these going in next to somebody's house, then let's just let them in all of these other areas and just say, this is what we want to protect. We don't want anyone any closer than, whether it's 100 feet or 200 feet or 1,000 feet.
But then what happens then when you have new residential building? They would have to follow those rules too and be that far away from the tower? How does that work for new building, new residential? I don't know.
even if you, I guess if you said, existing residential needed a additional 150 foot buffer. I'm not talking about anything crazy, but just an additional buffer. New residential, if someone wants to move up to it, that doesn't bother me. That doesn't, if you want to move, if you don't have any concern whatsoever, that is not something that bothers me. I see people buy houses and build houses and do all kinds of things next to stuff that wouldn't probably be my cup of tea, but if that's what you want to do, that's fine, and that doesn't bother me. But again, if it's existing, if there was a little buffer, and I'm not talking about anything crazy, an additional 100 feet, additional 150 feet, something like that.
I think you leave that up to the landowner who wants to develop it, how they want to develop it. That's
For new, yeah.
for new, because that's their choice.
Yeah.
If they want to take the risk of putting R1 up against it, that's theirs, or whatever they put up against it.
Does Brandon have such a thing as just like a permitted conditional use that you maybe it excludes residential, but a tower could be a conditional use on XYZ other zoning districts, as opposed to just pigeonholing it to one, but you just make it clear it can't be in residential, but maybe the others qualify? At least my understanding of conditional use is then it would have to come before this group before it was ever built in each case.
I don't think we have a universal, but I think it could be listed as a conditional use in different zones and then, yeah.
I think that's kind of what Brian was leaning towards. If our goal is to protect residential, then why don't we just protect residential and go from there, kind of.
what I'm hearing is for 3A, we are stepping back the all new facilities shall be set back at least 300 feet from a residentially zoned or used property to all facilities shall be set back at least the height of the tower from. Would we want to do residentially zoned and used, or would we just want to do zoned? Used is kind of interpretation of what is residentially used. But, so that's what I'm kind of hearing. We want to, if we're interested in protecting residential, we would somehow modify the 300 number rather than rewrite the requirement.
See, you would say the height of the tower away from any residential zoning? Is that,
With an additional buffer for existing residential versus new residential.
So then aren't you double dipping?
I don't get what you mean.
I think
Well,
a
we would have
tower-
we would have to have a setback anyway for the tower, right? We're having the setback already for the height of the tower. Right. And then for existing residential, I'm just saying, give an additional buffer for existing residential. So you don't have a tower going in on your smaller parks and things like that, right up against residential.
So it would be like tower height to the property line. So it would be tower height like plus 50 to residential. Or
Yeah, plus
property
50
line
or
plus
plus
50
100 or something like that.
But you're differentiating between residential zoning that residential zoning and possible future residential zoning? Is that what you're saying? Or I'm trying to understand what you're saying.
If there's existing, if you have a new development and there's no houses there, it's residential, you could put the lots closer to the tower than you can on existing residential. So if you're planning a development, you can plan a area for a tower, you can plan the houses closer to it than you could on an existing residential.
We're talking about the approval of a tower, so you can only consider that for what exists. I mean, the opposite would be, so I don't get I think you'd only be considering what's existing, because it'd be the point in
I
time when
think
the tower is
just
being,
whatever is zoned residential at the time that the ordinance goes into effect, or that at the time that we write the ordinance. Anything that happens in the future happens in the future, we deal with it then.
But are we saying like the height of the tower plus 150, or the height of the tower and then enough to make 150?
What if we looked at it a little bit different way? What if we said 3 times the height of the tower from residential property? And so here's why I'm thinking of maybe just a different approach. So if somebody wants to put a 100-foot freestanding tower up, and maybe 3 times isn't the right height, but just hear me out here. So if they want to put a 100-foot freestanding tower, it'd have to be 300 feet from a residential property line, existing residential property line. If they wanted to put a 10-foot tower on top of a building, it would only have to be 30 feet away from a residential property. But if that 10-foot tower is sitting on top of a 50-foot building, it's not going to be as obtrusive as a 60-foot tower. You guys get where I'm coming at here. So, and maybe it's not 3 times, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 2. I don't know, but that way it's not just X number of feet. It's based on how tall the tower is. If it's a 60-foot tower, not every tower has to be a 100-foot tower. It's going to be based on, the lay of the land, how tall that tower needs to be.
Would that eliminate the property line distance? Would it just be that number and not both? that number and the must be a distance from the property line? Would it just be the distance from residential or whatever that 3 times?
I think if we can, I think it's kind of the consensus here is to protect existing residential property. So if we have other setbacks, that's another topic, but if we can at least come to an agreement about, okay, how far do we want these from residential, I think is a starting point. And then other requirements within that specific property, we would still have to address, but.
Yeah, so if you said, whatever, the height of the tower, or 2 times or 5 times, or however much, you say X amount from the base of the tower, X amount from the base of the tower has to be, is the amount it has to be away from anything zoned residential. Okay, now somebody comes in later and says, I want to build a house and it's closer than that. And I want to build it to live in. Well, that's your prerogative. Or I want to build it for resale. Well, then it's your prerogative whether you think you can resell it or not. That's, the tower was put where it needs to be according to the ordinance. If you later on want to build something closer than that, it's your prerogative to take that risk. You can or you don't have to.
Well, if it's to the property line, they wouldn't be anywhere for them to build.
Or they come in and say, I want to build something closer than that, so would you rezone this, whatever it is, NRC, whatever it is, will you please rezone it into residential? Well, you say, well, the tower's already there and you know it's there, you can see it. So, is that really what you want to do? Yeah. That's what
I think with this, if we say, X number of distance from existing residential, I think that probably addresses Michael's comment about one going in a small neighborhood park. If we're saying it has to be 100 feet from the property line, and we got a 200 foot by 200 foot neighborhood park, we could put a 100-foot tower in there and piss off a whole bunch of people. But now if we wanted to put one in a park the size of McCarty or Aspen, that's a different story.
So the marker is not, if I'm understanding, the marker would not be from the property line where the tower is located, but rather from the edge of any residential zoning.
Existing residential zoning, and then if somebody wants to build closer to it, that's their prerogative. It's like if somebody wants to build right next to a railroad track or a high power line or.
That doesn't really solve your problem about the particular property where you want to go right now.
Well, not if it's 3 times. If it's 3 times, the 300 feet thing it's sort of a wash, I guess, from where it currently is. I guess that's why we gave the examples of other similar communities do the 1.1 times height. Perhaps you recommend it be something a little taller than that, but that tends to be the standard that we see. I guess as it relates, the topic's come up a few times of the risk of someone building one in a smaller park. I mean, ultimately, parks are owned by the city, right? It's not like someone can build a tower without the city allowing them to. So it seems like a limited risk.
It's a limited risk until it happens. Right now, as we're having this discussion, and there will be listening, it'll be in the paper and things like that. But if it's in our ordinance and it's something that's permitted, then the conversation isn't there and the pressure isn't there, so then it can happen. So down the road, that's kind of our concern with conditional use things, is that if we're not specific enough on things that we can be specific about, then something can come with a conditional use and we might not be, on the ball or something, and something could get through. So we want to be as specific as we can and find these problems while we're discussing it and hash them out and find the errors in our ways.
So a conditional use doesn't have like a public comment period or something. Like you can kind of sneak that by. Is that maybe what you're
It
saying?
does.
It does.
It does have
It's
public comment.
noticed in the paper and all
Yeah.
that fun stuff, and people can come and speak their piece.
Okay.
But you have to have a reason to say no, not just because that's the way you feel. You have to have something, some basis to say no. And so, as Michael said, if it's allowed in a park, we have to have a reason to say no. And could the city say no? I suppose, but that's where I always come from.
Understood.
Most times, as Alyssa talked about earlier, most times our smaller parks are surrounded by residential. So if you have a height from the the height from the structure or whatever, the distance from the structure, chances are, in most of those smaller parks, you'd be hard pressed to probably even get 1.1 times the height of the tower to one of those residential properties. We haven't, of course, measured them all out, but it's trying to figure out now what you want that number to be, whether it's 1.1, whether it's 1.5, whether it's
What about 1.5 as a compromise?
So you said this tower you're talking about is 120 feet.
That's right.
So that's, okay, math in my head. 120 plus 60, 180.
170 maybe? I got my math right?
180.
1.5 times 120?
No, 180.
180. 180.
Yeah.
Which I think we wouldn't meet with the school to the south. So we'd have to figure something else out.
Is the school to the south still R1? Probably.
I believe so.
So if the school would rezone, though, that would eliminate so that would be a conversation you'd have with the school district. If they would
Sounds
rezone
tricky.
to institutional, then you would not be measured from a residential. So
Sure.
that would be a conversation you'd have with the school.
Is that something the school has indicated that they might do, is rezone to institutional?
Yes, generally we have talked about it. Their admin building is institutional. Is the Bergman school, is that institutional? So the new school will be institutional. So they are kind of moving in that direction. Whether they'll do that with all of them and when, I don't know. That's kind of on them. We're not gonna rezone another person's property, so that's on them.
Unless they had a compelling reason, they probably don't have enough incentive to do it, but they could request it, yeah.
Okay, so who wants to give Patrick some direction?
It would be worth talking to the school. They haven't indicated any opposition to it. There are benefits to being an institutional for schools. So they might be willing to have the conversation.
Is the commission open to, there was previously stated the if you can get an adjacent property to give you the waiver or whatever you want to call that, that might be an easier lift with the school as opposed to getting them to rezone. You know, something to consider.
I'm not cool with that waiver stuff. No. Could be different owners in the future, and then come up, you have problems.
Waivers get lost when it comes time to sell. And that's the reason why I didn't know about that. And, you know, and if it's on your own property, that's one thing, but if it's on an adjacent property, that's a big deal. I still think these are acceptable in more than just HI and institutional. I don't see a reason why, like, we couldn't put one up behind Sunshine or, you know, over in the new development up by the interstate or, what's that? Yeah, I mean, you know, as long as we're far enough away from residential, yeah. So, you know, I think we're trying to fix everything. Let's focus on a portion of this at a time. You know, what zones do we want to allow it in, and how far away from residential do we want to be? And that's a starting point. And then once we get past that hurdle, then okay, what are the specifics within the individual property?
I think, yeah, I agree that other zones should be fine. I would stay away from, you know, residential and NRC. Other than that, I don't know what zones we'd have issues with. The biggest concern I have with a ratio thing is if someone came in, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, but this is what I would do if I was wanting to build a tower. If I wanted to build a 120-foot tower, but I didn't have room, but I could build a 75-foot tower, then I'd build a 75-foot tower, you know. So that's kind of my concern with going with a ratio for distance versus a foot for distance. If you said, you know, 200 feet from residential or something like that, just give extra buffer. Like I said, it doesn't have to be extreme, but even if we went 250, something like that, for residential versus a ratio, that'd be my concern with ratio is just that there would be a way to get around it.
How about, there's an example in here on page 16 from Watertown that towers should be separated, and these numbers could change, but it has both. It has separated from all residentially zoned lands by a minimum of X number of feet or X percentage of the height of the proposed tower, whichever is greater. So you'd kind of have a little both. You could have a minimum protection, and then if a really large tower was proposed, you'd have a proportional protection as well.
Yeah, so a 120-foot tower would be 240, you know, and if it was a 75-foot tower, it'd be 200 feet. So, yeah, I like that. I saw that earlier too. Forgot about it.
So that kind of gets us back to the beginning, where we had a 300-foot number, and it was was portrayed to us, I haven't drawn circles or anything, that the 300 number basically eliminates practically everything in town. So our FCC standard allowing us to make a decision rather than them make the decision is we can't prohibit or effectively prohibit. What number would basically keep us safe, do you feel? That wouldn't be too restrictive that they just overrule?
Well, if we went by that Watertown standard, they're about 240 at the site that they're looking at. They're about 240 to that property to the east. So you'd have to get your measurer out to see how you work there, and then if they could figure out something with the school property to the south, that would work there. I don't know what other areas in town they've looked at. But that would potentially work with that Watertown.
Just because we are an hour and a half into it. So just to clarify, we're looking at the kind of the Watertown standard with from all new facilities would be separated at least 200 feet or 200% of the tower height from an existing residentially zoned lot.
I like that structure. I don't know if I'm married to those numbers, but I like that, having that structure of having a minimum and a percentage.
Yeah, whichever is greater. I guess time, it's hard to set exact number because we don't know what the future will bring. We know we're going to need more towers in the future, but we don't know how tall they're going to be or anything like that. But it might be those numbers might be a good starting point.
Would it be helpful for you if, not to voluntold them, but if our engineering department had a CAD map or a map and they drew out where in town is 200 feet from a residential lot? And that way we could see it visually to make sure we're not basically sucking everything up.
Yeah, if we could see what that leaves us, that'd be good.
And I can't speak for the city, but who knows, it might be worth a conversation to ask about Aspen Park or McCarty Park.
Does looking at some circles work for you?
The difficulty with this, just for commentary, is you don't, correct me, I mean, I don't want to speak for your business, but if I understand the business, you don't put the tower in before the demand is there. You put the tower in after the demand is there.
You're playing for
So-
some future growth, but
Yeah, I mean, so you don't put the tower out in the middle of a cornfield first and wait for the people to come. We're trying to squeeze a tower into an area where we don't have these big expanses of commercial area. I mean, really, we don't have large expanses of commercial area like Sioux Falls does, and to be able to put these towers. So we're gonna struggle with this, regardless of what. Is it 200 feet? Is it 300 feet? Is it 100 feet? We're going to struggle with this in finding appropriate areas because of that, because we don't have these large areas away from residential.
We should keep that in mind as the eastern part of the city grows, because we know eventually we'll need something out there.
Sure, I mean, the city's gonna grow around the new school, just like it has to the south of town.
Do you need it on the south side of town for coverage, or is that just where you were finally able to find some land?
Verizon's required it on the south side of town.
So putting it by Sunshine's not gonna help.
Correct.
So just so we can plan out a future meeting. I know it's kind of tenuous this week with the holiday next week, and then some people have time off. So our next meeting would be January 2nd. I don't know if we would have probably circles turned around by then. Probably not. That's awfully quick. But would you want to see, what kind of circles would you want to see? Would you want to see a 1.1 circle? Would you want to see a 1.5, a 200, a 300? What spread of circles would you like? What would help set a number?
Yeah, I think if it's, if it's doable, I think 100, 200, 300 almost, but it's a lot of circles, but
200, I can,
200 because
I-
then you can
I
visualize.
can visualize a smaller or a larger circle when I look at it. If I look at a circle of a certain size, I can visualize a smaller or a larger one. 200 would be great for me.
Well, the advantage of having some other options is if you go from 200 to 150, you're going to have more options at 150% or 150 feet or whatever than you are at 200 feet. And so the advantage of having different circles is you get to see how, at 200 feet, we might have an option. Yeah, we might have a couple of options. But at 150 feet, there might be 10 options. At 100 feet, there might be 20 options. I don't think we're going to get to 20 options, but it might be 10 options at 100 feet, 5 options at 150 feet, and 1 or 2 options at 200 feet. So I think that's the point of having the different circles, is you get to see what a smaller radius gives you for opportunities.
Right, but the most recent thing we said was, oh, this one in Watertown looks good where it's 200 feet or 1 point, or percentage of the tower, whichever is bigger. So
Watertown's
200 then
also,
would be your smallest.
as a city, structurally different than Brandon. Watertown is the hub of that area where Sioux Falls is our hub. So the city is structured a little bit differently.
And that's why I asked, because I like that structure, but I don't know what others think, but I don't want to bind us to that 200 because I don't know if it's feasible. So I think it might not help us, but it may. So we might need to look at least consider something smaller.
I think if we could get 100, 150, and 200, I think that would be great. I don't know how much effort that takes, but
All right, have we exhausted this issue?
So it sounds like we have kind of a general format we want to look at, and we'll look at some maps and see what looks reasonable in comparison to what is too prohibitive or effectively prohibited. So
Thank you for your patience. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your time. You guys have a happy holidays.
Yep. Merry
You too.
Christmas. Can we move on to 9 then? Moving on.
So, what we wanted to include in there, so we talked about short-term rentals quite a bit last time. We just wanted to include in there, since the one person did mention, he came in from Sioux Falls looking to start out here. So they do have it's more of kind of a permitting scheme rather than a land use necessarily program. So it's a permit rather than a zoning matter. That kind of sounded like what you were all interested in. Obviously, we don't have the capability to do various health inspections and all that kind of thing, but if that's more the approach you are interested in, we can start there and then we can kind of set the background rules. A couple of things talking with the city administrator he mentioned was, would you want some, so while it wouldn't be as a permit, a conditional use permit, would you want some kind of, neighbors are going to want to come in and say their piece. Would you want some kind of, since we just talked about waivers, would you want, if you're within, so we have to send out letters to 300 feet if it's a conditional use. Would you want some kind of percentage of neighbors within a certain proximity have to give their blessing to it? Is that too much control to giving to neighbors? Would you want to have a requirement that all of them have to have some kind of privacy fence in the backyard? So there's a variety of ways to do it. We're just kind of, if you want the permit way, what would you like us to look at?
I do like the idea of having either if the owner resides more than 50 miles from Sioux Falls or Brandon, whatever, provide contact. I do think that there should be some kind of a property manager or owner that's in the city or within, even 50 miles is a ways, but someone that's accessible